Good morning. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program at the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. We're joined this morning by Simon Shuster, Time Magazine staff reporter and author of the book, The Showman, Inside the Invasion That Shook the World and Made a Leader of Volodymyr Zelensky, which is the subject of today's live stream. Simon is with us today from London. We are also joined by Tamar Jacoby, our moderator, who serves as director of the new Ukraine Project at the Progressive Policy Institute. She's with us tonight from Kyiv, so thank you both for being here with us from across the world. For those of you who would like to submit questions for our speakers, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. My colleague Katie Gilman will be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. So thank you both for being here, and tomorrow I'll hand the conversation over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and hello, Simon. Kudos on a great read. I think the book is terrific. I think for readers who've been following the news, they're going to learn things. Even for readers who've been following the news, they're going to learn things about Ukraine they didn't know. Always a big question about a newsy book. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So let's start up close and personal with Zelensky. Before you get to your kind of larger view, your argument, your thesis, whatever, give us a feeling for the man. Is he funny? Is he moody? Does he speak in profanities? I'll never forget the American senator I met who I thought was an eloquent spokesman, but he couldn't speak in private except in profanities. Tell us something we don't know about Zelensky's personal presence and affect.
Well, I guess it depends on which Zelensky you mean. He's transformed so much, even in the 4 years that I've known him, that it's sometimes.
I'm going to ask about that.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to pinpoint what has remained the same about him. But I think one thing that comes across when you meet him in person is he's very straightforward, very direct, much more so than the average politician that I've met and talked with. He comes across as just kind of a normal guy. He often starts a conversation by asking you not only how are you doing, but what do you think about what's going on? What's your take? Where are you coming to this conversation from? What are you hearing? As though he's trying to also mine every one of his interlocutors, even the journalists. And I've seen him do this really with all kinds of people he meets, from soldiers to regular citizens to foreign leaders. Tries to really get as much knowledge from them as possible. I guess early on, you asked if he's funny. Earlier on in our acquaintance, he was much funnier. There was a lot more kind of small talk, banter, sarcasm. Now, in our more recent interviews, during the invasion, he's much tougher, and very little time for levity in the conversations. And there's just a kind of a toughness and a steeliness about him that is quite different. But that openness, the sense that he really wants to understand what you're about and what you need, and to answer your questions very directly, that's been my experience.
Yeah, great. That's really interesting. It's a sort of another version of the same question, but you followed him for 4 years, and I think you had 5 sit-down, formal interviews with him. Did you feel you got to know the man like behind the mask? I mean, performers, politicians, we almost never get behind the mask. Did you feel that you got to see something of the man behind the mask?
I didn't get the sense that he wears a mask in the way that so many politicians I've met before. I mean, I remember the first president of Ukraine that I spoke with and interviewed and profiled was Viktor Yanukovych back in 2012. He really came off as someone who, when I entered the room, stiffened and sort of remembered it. It felt like he was remembering his media training and like what did they tell me to say? What did they tell me not to say? He seemed very inauthentic, whereas Zelensky kind of breezes right in, and his demeanor, his posture, and the way he talks and what he says doesn't change that much, between our kind of formal sit-down interviews and then more informal interludes in our communications and the time we spent together. He's kind of the same. He's very consistent. It's not like he kind of turns on a communication mode or a presidential mode. On the contrary, I think he's been quite successful. You know, as he told me when he was running for president, I don't want to change. I don't want to become a politician. I want to remain the person that my character and my experience has forged. Of course, he hasn't been completely successful in that, but I think he has maintained the kind of easiness and the openness that defined his character in the entertainment world and that I met on the campaign trail. So I'm not sure there is a mask in that way.
Super interesting, super interesting. Okay, so now let's zoom out and tell us your kind of official take on the book, on the man. What's the frame of your book? Your title is Showman. Is that your thesis? And what do you mean by that?
Well, I should say that the book, the aim of the book is to chronicle the events that led up to the full-scale invasion and then what followed, the way that President Zelensky and his team experienced it and responded to it. It tries to be, as kind of straight down the middle and just the facts, present the facts of what happened. And I try as much as possible to leave my own kind of an analysis, interpretation, prognostication out of it. I'm not sure I succeed completely, but if there is a kind of an idea to the book that I think runs through many of the chapters, it's that to my surprise in reporting on Zelensky, the man and the leader and the wartime president, his gifts and skills that he honed as an entertainer in the movie business and as a communicator and a showman have served him incredibly well and have served Ukraine extremely well over the course of the invasion. They've allowed him to grab and hold the attention of the world and to keep our focus on this war and the images of the war that he needs us to see to maintain our support for a much longer time, I think, than a more traditional kind of classically trained diplomat or politician would have been able to do. So I think I try to show a number of examples over the course of the book, how his toolkit as a showman that he brought with him into politics, into the presidency, and then into his wartime leadership, how that toolkit developed, what's in it, and how it has been useful to him.
Yeah, great. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's talk about the famous transformation. You do have an argument about a man transformed, and bring it up to the present, because I think I've seen a few transformations if you come all the way to today. What's your argument about transformation?
My sense is that anyone thrust into that position, as he was on February 24th, 2022, where you are suddenly under attack by a nuclear superpower that wants to kill you, kill your family, at the very least capture you and take you hostage, and take over your entire country. There is no one is prepared for that. Anyone put into that position, to a large extent, would need to assume a new persona, to step into a new role of a wartime leader in command of a country under attack and fighting for its survival. So I think the nimbleness that was required of him also in part derives from his past experience and his ability to transform himself. The one transformation that certainly comes to mind is his transformation from a showman, an actor and comedian into a political figure and a president. That was one transformation that required a great deal of mental agility and a kind of comfort with taking on new roles, new challenges, and becoming really a new person, you could say. And I think that flexibility served him also very well once the invasion started. So he was able to transform really before our eyes, such that he appeared within hours of the invasion almost fully formed as this kind of wartime icon, right down to the clothes he was wearing, the tone he used, the way, the aesthetic almost of the videos that he has released day in, day out now for a little over 2 years. So he was able to make that transformation very nimbly and quickly, and I think that also is one of the tools in his toolkit from his career as an actor.
Yeah, I sometimes think of it as the moment made the man. I mean, obviously he took it, he had to ride the moment, but in some way that moment he transformed himself to master that moment.
Yeah.
What about since? I mean, I've seen a big difference if you compare those early war, post full-scale invasion videos to, for example, the press conference at the end of last year, different person. And as you say, not so funny, very different person. What about the transformation of the last, more recent transformation? Is there another one?
Well, I've talked to him about that. The thing that comes to mind is really the pain and the horror that he has witnessed. It's a kind of trauma. I mean, when I in the book I include 2 photos of him, one 2 months before he became president, and one 2 months after the full-scale invasion. There's a difference of about 3 years there. It looks like he's aged 10, 15 years. I mean, it's right down to the kind of the way that this war has etched itself into his face, the creases in his face, the creases around his eyes. And I asked him about that process of aging and changing, that he looks so different. And he said, yeah, the reason is the war crimes and the horrors and atrocities that I see day in, day out that the Russian soldiers perpetrate against Ukrainian civilians and Ukraine as a nation. He carries that. He carries that grief and that pain. He channels the grief and the pain of the Ukrainian people, but a lot of it remains on his shoulders and in his eyes and on his face. That is the transformation that I've seen, and it's tragic. As he put it when we talked about this, he said, "I never had the goal of attaining the kind of knowledge that I have had to absorb," referring to the horrors of war.
Yeah, powerful. So, I mean, as well as me, better than me probably, there are very different views of him in kind of in the West, in the broader world, than in Ukraine. The way I think of it is, people in the West sort of think he can walk on water. Nobody in Ukraine thinks he can walk on water. And I guess I sort of see, as I was reading your book, I saw you sort of somewhere in between there, those 2 views. Would you agree with that? Where are you on that spectrum?
Interesting. I never thought about it really, or placing myself on the spectrum. I tried to be as fair and honest as I could. Of course, I have great respect and admiration for the man, the leader, but I had to be honest about pointing out any kind of flaws or mistakes that I saw along the way. It's a challenge. Objectivity is always the ideal that journalists strive toward, but it is an ideal. We never reach it fully. So I tried to be as honest with my readers as possible, and just to call it like I saw it. And if I felt admiration and I felt awe in some of the things he was doing, I wrote that. And if I felt that he had crossed the line or done something hypocritical that went against a value or a goal that he had espoused earlier in our conversations, I would also point that out to him, and I would point that out in the text of the book.
Yeah, you're anticipating my next question, actually, because, really my question is, how much is it the biographer's role to judge, to have judgments? Because, a lot of reviewers have said you managed to avoid hagiography, and I think that's true, but is that hard? You're writing about someone who's so admired in the world as he is. Is it hard to avoid hagiography? Are you tempted to sort of shade over some of those things that trouble you or don't like? I mean, you just answered it, but maybe you say,
I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, and I really don't feel now, and I didn't feel when I was writing the book, that it is my place or my role to judge him, or even to sort of say that, this decision or that decision was wrong. I sort of lay out the reasoning behind certain decisions and the options that were available to him, why each of them were kind of flawed or problematic, the pluses and minuses of various options, and then I describe what in the end he chose to do and what happened. But I try not to make a judgment about, imagining some alternative realities of what would have transpired if. I don't go into hypotheticals. And also, fundamentally, he pointed this out to me, I think, on more than one occasion, that later he will be judged. He's 46 years old now. He's still very much fighting this war. He's still very much leading Ukraine through this war, and it's absolutely clear that the final judgment of history is yet to come, and that's one of the reasons I think that he felt the book was kind of a little premature because his story is yet to be written, and he said at one point, later we will be judged. He said, I am not finished with the work that I've set out to accomplish for this country.
Yeah, I was gonna, I mean, you explained exactly what I was gonna comment. I mean, I see a certain kind of restraint. In the book, there's certain things that surprise me, even trouble me, that I probably would have been tempted to say something about, but you show and don't judge in a way that I think, serves you well, actually.
Thank you.
So let's talk about a couple of specific issues before we come to the present. I do want to come to the present and sort of beyond your time frame. But I mean, one of the things that really struck me, because I think a lot about Ukrainian history, and so do you, and the book has a lot about Ukrainian history, is how much he sort of is an emblem of how Ukraine and Russia were intertwined until very recently. I mean, the idea that to make his career as an entertainer, I don't like to call him a comedian. I mean, he was so much more than a comedian, but, he had to go to Moscow. He had to live in Moscow to make his career. Before 1990, you couldn't buy books. Every book you bought here was printed in Moscow. Journalists came here from, you know better than me. You were here. I mean, you don't comment on that, but that was one of my big takeaways, that he had to go make his career in Moscow. And he was even in Moscow at the time of the Revolution of Dignity, as I read your account. Am I misreading something there? I mean, I thought that was sort of extraordinary.
That's right. I think his life experience does run in parallel to the transformation of Ukraine. His life experience shows in many ways the bonds that existed between these countries, their cultures, their economies before 2014, before Russia first invaded Ukraine and attacked Ukraine militarily. Before that point, Zelensky very much aspired to be successful and beloved by audiences in both countries, both Russia and Ukraine. His business spanned both countries. Indeed, about 85% of his income as an entertainer, so broadly speaking, his movies, his TV shows, everything, his business, 85% roughly came from the Russian market, not the Ukrainian market. And I think, to be a success, to be number one in the field that he had devoted himself to as an entertainer, you had to work in Moscow, because that is where the biggest movies and TV shows in the Russian-speaking world were produced. He, of course, performed always, and his output as a maker of TV shows and movies was in Russian, in the Russian language. That's where he had partners, producers, fellow actors that he collaborated with. So I think in many ways that part of his life shows just how tight the bonds were before Vladimir Putin broke them by stabbing Ukraine in the back with the annexation of Crimea. And it's very interesting to see how Zelensky reacted to that. So at that point, we see him essentially ripping himself away from Russia. He wound down his projects in Russia, and that cost him dearly. As he once said in summarizing the pain to his business, 1 hour of television content before he broke his ties with Moscow, 1 hour would make him roughly $200,000. After, it was $30,000. So that's a huge blow, but he took a principled position. And he said after what the Russians did in Crimea and then in the Donbass, he could not take the stage with a smile on his face in Moscow after that. So we see a clear breaking point at that moment in history and in his life.
Yeah, amazing, amazing story. Okay, second sort of specific issue, his leadership style. Talk to us a little bit about his leadership style. And that is one place where you, I would say, raise some questions and indeed some concerns about the future. So do you want to share those with us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, his leadership style, it's hard to generalize. I don't really, in the book, I lay out sort of examples of his leadership and how he conducts himself. If there's anything to be said, kind of to generalize about his style, he is quite quick and intuitive in his decision making. He doesn't base his decisions as a rule on kind of careful analysis and data and charts and graphs. He kind of confronts a problem, confronts an issue, and shoots from the gut, so to say. He very quickly chooses a course of action. Once he has chosen a course of action, and he kind of commits himself to it intuitively, it's very difficult to change his mind. So he's quite stubborn and strong-willed, and people who attempt to steer him in a different direction or to, again, present him with kind of, boss, here are the charts and graphs, and our analysis suggests that maybe we should adjust. That's a good way to be kind of pushed aside. Historically speaking, there are a number of examples where once he sets himself on a course, he keeps going and plowing toward it. Yeah, that is a particular style. I think it served him quite well in the invasion. Very decisive, very quick to make decisions. I think in the early hours of the invasion, the way that manifested itself was quite interesting. What the Russians maybe were expecting was a kind of paralysis to set in among the leadership in Kiev, that the scale and the complexity of the threats coming from multiple directions, an attack from the air with bombardment, from the north, east, and south with ground troops and artillery fire, for that to just short circuit the leadership, the structure of the state. But instead, Zelensky became what one of his advisors described to me as a decision generator. He very quickly began sort of issuing commands and orders, often laced with profanities, and often, not based in any kind of experience or analysis or data. But he wasn't shy about pumping out instructions down the hierarchy of the state. And that sort of left no dead air on the radio once the invasion was going. He was sort of demonstratively in command. So anyway, there are upsides and downsides to that leadership style. I think one downside would be that he's fairly impatient with people who try to argue with him, to argue with his decisions.
Well, you also talk about your kind of last pages, you talk about some concerns about, how will he make the transition to a post-war order, and, will there be a kind of authoritarian, I don't know if you actually use that word, but a kind of streak of that. Does that go with the leadership style? And, talk to us about that concern.
Yeah, I think I do actually use that word. So I mean, those concerns are real, and I pose the question. So I don't end the book on some conclusion about what the future will look like under Zelensky, but I think that the question is worth raising. What, after what I sincerely hope will be Ukraine's definitive victory in this war, what will Ukraine look like? What will it look like under Zelensky? What will his leadership be at a time when, for one thing, Ukraine will be in desperate economic straits, when its infrastructure will have been terribly damaged and will need to be reconstructed, when you'll have many soldiers returning from the front in need of social support, economic support, psychological support, when you'll have refugees returning. It'll be a very unstable and difficult and challenging political environment. So the question that comes up in my mind is how will that be managed while also returning to kind of democracy as normal? Once you lift martial law, and this is what Zelensky promises in my conversations and generally in his statements, it's quite simple as he puts it. We win the war, we lift martial law, and we go back to democracy as normal, with competitive elections, with the normal functioning of parliament, with a very critical and lively media environment. But I do wonder how easy or difficult that transition will be. I think it will be very difficult. And I think history shows that often the kinds of power, the power that is concentrated in the presidency at a time of war under martial law, that kind of power, once you have it for an extended period, is difficult to give up. And I do think that'll be a major challenge for Ukraine as a nation and Zelensky as a person and as a leader.
Yeah, I worry about that myself. Okay, so let's pivot beyond the frame of your book, if you will. You know, your book ends more than, I don't know, a year ago, whatever it is. You can pinpoint that for us maybe. But have you well, let's go to a few specific things. You know, you set up the triangle, let's call it, Zelensky, Zaluzhny, Syrskyi. You know, it's something that just happened a few weeks ago, really. You saw starting a few, you know, more than a year ago. So tell us about that, and tell us about what you know, was what happened. Talk to the audience about what you think about what happened recently. Zelensky did replace his trusted commander-in-chief, you know, certainly against, you know, my understanding of what most Ukrainians, you know, want or expect.
Yeah, so I observed those tensions starting around the summer of 2022. So really just a few months into the invasion, as President Zelensky developed his own vision for how to fight this war down to the tactical military level. And as his confidence in his own abilities as a military strategist grew. If in the early days and weeks of the invasion, he really left the fighting up to the generals, over time, he did develop his own priorities and on the battlefield. And that led to tensions with the generals when they disagreed on issues of military strategy. So I think the relationship there between Zelensky and General Zaluzhny is one of the two relationships that I really follow closely over a long period of time. The other one being the relationship between the president and the first lady. We can talk about that later if you like. But I saw the intensity of the tensions there between the president and the general kind of escalating. And I take readers through kind of how it started, how they met, and why they began to clash, and what results really that had on the conduct of the war and specific battles and decisions that were made. In many ways, when Zelensky dismissed the general this year, I was surprised by how long it took.
Yeah.
Because, you know, under the Constitution, Zelensky is the supreme commander in chief. It is his role and his right to choose the military leadership that he is comfortable working with and that he feels is best. And I could see behind the scenes, well before the tensions between them kind of broke into the open, I'd say last fall, a few months ago, I could see that it was quite distracting for the leadership, for the military leadership, for the political leadership. You don't want to have the two most powerful men in the country feuding behind the scenes at a time of war. So in the end, he did decide to dismiss the general. I've been very gratified and honestly relieved to see how smoothly it was done. I did speak with a source close to the general after the general was dismissed, and the source told me that they agreed before the dismissal was made public to not show any signs of conflict once it did become public, once it became official, because they knew, as this source put it, that any signs of conflict between them would only help the enemy. So that's been quite a relief. You know, I think things could have gone much less smoothly. I was afraid that perhaps the general would start criticizing the president once he was dismissed, and that somehow the tensions would continue to play out in the public arena. And thankfully they haven't. I think that also is a credit to the president's ability to manage, to communicate, and to lead, and to make sure that these kinds of, you know, internal problems are kept under control. I think he handled it quite well.
I mean, it's a credit to him, but it's also a credit to Zaluzhny. I mean, Zaluzhny basically literally fell on his sword for the effort.
Yeah.
You know, swallowed it, and, you know, for the sake of remaining strong. Okay, talk about Zelensky and conscription. You know, and that seemed to me to be one of the issues that maybe divided them the most at the end. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but just watching from the outside, Zelensky's saying very publicly, we need a lot more people. The people who've been fighting have been there for 2 years and they're tired. And, we've all seen this. We've all talked to those tired old middle-aged soldiers. And Zelensky's seemingly hesitant to do that. And, you could read it cynically, which I'm not necessarily doing, but one could, and say, well, it won't be politically popular to conscript another 500,000 people, or even, 250,000 people. What's going on with the conscription story? And is there something interesting you can tell us about that we're not reading in the public prints?
Well, yes. So I would say that is problem number one, politically and militarily. That is the biggest and most difficult challenge that I see. Even in the context of the Americans still not coming through with their aid and the Republicans in Congress blocking it, yes, that is critically important. A lot of the challenges that Zelensky faces are critically important, but the question of where to get more soldiers, how to inspire Ukrainians to volunteer for the military, or if they've been injured and sent to heal, to come back after that and continue to serve on the front lines. That is a massive challenge. I think as one of Zelensky's aides told me, even if they get all the weapons that they are requesting from the West, currently they don't have the men to use them. And that is a very, very grim thing to hear and painful to hear. Also, if you look at I reported back in October that the average age of the soldier fighting in Ukraine, the Ukrainian soldier, is 43 years. I've heard from my sources that since then it's gone up into the mid or even the late 40s. So compared to the U.S. military or European militaries, that is very high, very high, and alarming.
You feel that when you go to the front. I mean, they're all middle-aged men. What about, last issue like this, elections and postponing elections. It seemed like a crazy idea to me that there should be elections in the middle of a war. The sort of the scuttlebutt around here was, Zelensky was tempted because, his popularity is only going to drop. Thank goodness it hasn't happened. The scuttlebutt could be entirely wrong, like most scuttlebutt. But what is there to say about the postponement? And it does resonate. I noticed this because I pay a lot of attention to the American debate, that it's resonating with the the Republican base that we're worried about. Why aren't they having elections? What's to be said about that?
Well, I discussed this in detail with the president in the fall when he was considering it. I'd say it was a couple of weeks before he finally, took a position and made clear that there would not be elections in the spring. All he talked about were the practical reasons not to do it. First of all, under martial law, it is illegal to hold elections. So you would have to either lift martial law temporarily in the middle of a war, or somehow amend that legal restriction. I think even more to the point, you have nearly 20% of the territory under occupation, millions of people there who would not be able to participate in the elections. You have millions more refugees outside the country, millions yet more displaced internally, so they're not physically living in the places where they are registered to vote, another huge logistical hurdle. So these are the kinds of things that he talked to me about when I asked him about his thinking on the elections. About the scuttlebutt, I did hear from people in the administration that actually, politically speaking, if you set aside all of the practical reasons not to do it, politically, it makes sense for him to lock in another term. He is currently by far the most popular politician, I want to stress, politician in the country, and he would be very likely to win if the elections were held now. Or this spring. So there was a temptation, politically speaking, to do it, even if it's difficult, even if there are questions about its legitimacy, to just lock in that 5-year term and then kind of just kick the can down the road. But the president was very much against that. He said, what kind of elections will those be? First of all, extremely expensive, extremely distracting. And also it would bring out all of that disunity that comes with an election campaign, where all of the political forces in the country that may have been tamping down or holding back their fire in the political arena, all of them would begin, attacking the president and really vying for power, which would be extremely destabilizing. So that was the nature of the conversation, and I think when you weigh those up, the arguments against having elections are much stronger. At least that's the way it seemed to the president and to me after talking to the president.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so last question. We have to go. Or last question from me. We have to go to questions from the audience. I know nobody can predict where the war is going, and I'm not asking you to do that. But is there anything that you want to say to this audience about sort of where we are in the military, course of things, and maybe what to look for, what to expect, what to hope for, maybe, realistically?
Yes. Thank you. Yes. So I don't make prognoses. I'm very bad at it. When I do, I usually get it wrong. But I can tell you a couple of things that are important to watch if you want to understand where the war is going. So these kind of long-term trends that we can already see developing. One is, and unfortunately it gets very little attention and play in the international media, is the kind of architecture for negotiations that Ukraine has been working on. So at the end of 2022, November 2022, President Zelensky presented this 10-point peace plan at the G20 summit in Bali. You can go back and find the text. It's out there. And ever since then, he and his administration, this effort has been led by Andrei Yermak, his chief of staff. They've been trying to essentially set the table for a possible negotiation in the future, to set the terms and to build an alliance of countries that would be behind Ukraine once it or if it decides to sit down at that negotiating table, so that they are not pushed into a negotiating process that where the Russians are setting the terms, or a negotiating process that Ukraine doesn't want to participate in. They have very actively been building the architecture for a peace process. So this suggestion that you often hear that, Zelensky doesn't want to negotiate, he only wants to fight, that is really not true. Like they're working very hard on this kind of diplomatic effort, and it's quite interesting and important to follow, and I think we're going to see it play out. Second point is domestic production of weapons. They see very clearly that, well, for one thing, Donald Trump could return to the White House, and he has promised to turn off the taps and try to force Zelensky into some kind of negotiation. Generally, they see as a strategic risk a decline in Western support and military aid. So they have put a lot of effort, a lot of investment, and a lot of thinking into ramping up domestic weapons production. The person in charge of that is Minister Alexander Kamyshin, the Minister of Strategic Industries, and their efforts to try to basically win the war in the factory is very interesting and very impressive what they've achieved, especially in drone warfare and some of these other kind of technologically advanced approaches that we see play out very often in the news. When you see a Russian battleship sinking in the Black Sea, when you see a Russian oil terminal blowing up in the Leningrad Oblast, or a steel factory in Norilsk, more often than not, those are homemade Ukrainian weapons doing that. So that is not nothing. So that's definitely something to watch. And generally, one more kind of broad philosophical point, I guess, about the future. It's tempting often to look at the news of the day, the week, the month, and fall into a depression. So the Ukrainians withdraw from Avdiivka, the Russians advance into that town, the population 30,000 or so before the invasion. And you see these Western leaders, analysts, some people in Ukraine grabbing their heads and saying, "Ay, ay, ay, we're losing, we've lost, that's it." I would just encourage people, and I hope the book helps some readers do that. Just remember the larger arc of this war and how many times the Ukrainians have surprised us in turning things around and finding ways to kick the Russians' butts. And I think if you keep that larger perspective and you don't fall into the periods of doom and gloom that arise now and then, I think it's much easier to keep faith, as I do, in Ukraine's ultimate victory.
Great place to stop and invite our question manager onto the stage. I have a million more questions, but I'm sure the audience does too. So hello, Katie.
Yeah, hi. I just want to say thank you, Simon and Tamar, for such a thoughtful discussion already. And our audience is eager in the Q&A box, so I'm excited to join you too and just get right into these topics. So the question I want to start with is one on your book. So what are your hopes for the impact this book will have on the understanding of the war and its historical significance?
I think part of the value of it, I hope for history and for Ukrainians in understanding the events they're living through in this war, is that I was able, thanks to the president and his team, to observe them as many of these historic events were happening, and to speak to them in the moment. So it's very kind of up close and immediate in the impressions that I was able to gather and to put in the book. These are not, as you often read in kind of military histories and so on, recollections many years after the fact, where people are reflecting on events through a certain kind of lens with a certain level of hindsight. So I think my ability to gather those impressions, in the moment, I hope will be valuable to history, to Ukrainians studying this history. And maybe another way I hope the book will be useful, I sincerely hope, is just to remind people, to take people back to those early days and weeks of the invasion, and remind people why we supported Ukraine so wholeheartedly in the beginning. To give people a bit more of that broader arc, not just of the day's news and the week's news, but to remember how this thing started, how we got here, and why we thought it was so important to support Ukraine in the first place, and why those reasons haven't gone anywhere. We still should. Zelensky has seen it from the very beginning of this invasion as part of his goal to keep the world's focus on the war, keep the world's attention. And at least in that small way, I hope the book and the conversations that the book seems to be, sparking, like this one, is helpful in that respect, at least.
Thank you. And touching a bit more on leadership styles, in your opinion, how effectively can a single leader, even a charismatic one like Zelensky, navigate a complex global conflict like this war?
Well, of course, you need a team, and it's been interesting to observe how the team has evolved. And in many ways, it's sort of predictable. They've become much more disciplined. It's a much smaller, tighter group. I think even in the beginning of the invasion, it was more haphazard, the way that they the style of leadership and the team. There were a lot of people there who could get to the president, could try to sort of take a piece of his attention, or tell him, boss, look at this. You need to pay attention to this. And it was sort of in some ways distracting or chaotic in the sensory overload, or the overload of challenges that were always kind of thrust at him. Now they've become much more disciplined as a team, and decisions are brought to the president when the lower level staffers and advisors are unable to resolve them. So I think that's generally what you want to see, a kind of military discipline setting in over time. But still, yeah, of course, Zelensky would not be able to handle it on his own. For one thing, he needs also the military commanders, right? He can't wage the battle on his own. So he relies on a great many people within his administration, in society, and in the military to help him. And in many ways, in many of those situations, he plays a supportive role. I mean, the question I heard him ask of the military in his conversations with them most often was, what do you need? How can I support you? How can I get you the support you need? And that's that shows the kind of synergies and the mutual interdependence that he has with the various elements of the Ukrainian state, who are all fighting this war together.
Yeah, that is extremely interesting. Thanks. And how do you think the international response to Zelensky's leadership during the invasion has impacted Ukraine's standing on the global stage? And what will that look like once the war is over, or when the leadership in Ukraine changes?
Thank you. Yeah, I've thought a lot about that question. So I remember one of my early conversations with President Zelensky in the first year of his presidency, at the end of 2019, I met him, and he was then mixed up in this whole scandal that led to Donald Trump's first impeachment in 2019, and he was also preparing for his first sit-down face-to-face negotiations with Putin, and just preparing for how difficult those would be. And I remember he expressed to me this frustration with the fact that Ukraine was often treated as a kind of a pawn on the chessboard of empires that were always pushing it around. That it seemed to him that he didn't get the respect he deserved as a head of state because he was the leader of Ukraine, which was often, treated by greater powers, larger powers, wealthier powers as a kind of second-class country, as he put it. And that deeply frustrated him. It was very difficult for him to get the attention of many of his peers in the West and internationally. Now, one thing that Ukraine has already achieved, no matter where this war goes, is a sense of agency and a seat at the table in international decision-making. I think no one would argue today that Zelensky's voice is not taken seriously. I think he has no trouble reaching out and getting the attention of, some of the most powerful leaders in the world. Some of the most powerful leaders in the world, indeed, are willing to take the train to visit him in his capital, sometimes on more than one occasion. So I think that sense of agency and its ability to steer and decide its own future is something that Ukraine has already achieved in this war. And I know that that's very gratifying to President Zelensky, given how frustrating it was for him three or 4 years ago to be in this position of a kind of geopolitical pushover is how he felt.
I'm really glad we got into that. That was fascinating. Thank you. And this audience member said, some observers claim that Ukraine's counteroffensive has stalled because Ukraine's military diluted its effect by opening too many small offensives. How do you think Zelensky would respond to this opinion?
Interesting. I mean, I don't, I kind of leave it to military analysts to parse questions like that. If you ask, and I've spoken to the president and his team about this, and also military commanders about that very question. I remember a conversation with a senior military officer, and I asked him this question of like, hey, if imagine a world where Ukraine had concentrated all of its forces on the push to the south and decided, for example, not to go take back the region of Kharkiv in September of 2022 and launch other offensives along the front line. Do you think that maybe the southern push toward Crimea, that really most important strategic direction, may have succeeded? And I was in some ways surprised to hear him say no. It's still the problems with the counteroffensive were more fundamental, and he said they had to do with the pace with which the weapons arrived from abroad. He said they were too slow and there weren't enough of them, and that was the problem. There was no getting around it. It's just, if we'd gotten more weapons more quickly, that would have been the decisive factor. And I've heard the same thing from the president's team. But I do think that the book presents certain kinds of military strategic forks in the road, or decisions about how to allocate resources to different parts of the front, or whether to engage and how long to engage in certain battles. I present the kind of pluses and minuses and the debates around those decisions in the book. I try not to judge who was right, who was wrong. First of all, I don't feel qualified. I'm not a military analyst or strategist. And generally, I think it'll be up to military historians to look back on that and try to think, about these possible realities and hypothetical scenarios that may have transpired, but didn't.
Great. And we're going to switch gears a little bit now. So this is more of a historical context question, but when Russian troops took over the Crimea Peninsula, in your opinion, why didn't international governments respond in the same way they did when the Russians invaded Ukraine?
Wow, that's a tough one. Yeah.
If only we could rewrite it.
Yeah. I mean, this goes to a lot of quite complicated issues about the Western fear of provoking a wider war. I think there was a sense in the Obama administration, which was in power, and also in Berlin, very importantly, with Chancellor Angela Merkel, that it was important not and Obama and Merkel were, when it came to Ukraine, generally on the same page. They were quite aligned there. There was very little daylight between them. They felt that the priority was not to escalate, to try to, yes, punish Russia, to condemn its actions, but not to allow for a wider war. And at least for a lot of European countries, and I am thinking of Germany in particular, it was strategically and economically crucial not to break the ties with Russia in terms of oil and gas supplies and other economic ties. So I think that was a big factor in the decision-making process. For Obama, it was more kind of containing the crisis, right? He didn't want the crisis to spiral, and that is why. But what we got was the worst of all worlds, where Putin took the lesson of like, hey, I can get away with this kind of thing, and without much in the way of consequences. Mm.
And what do you see as the most pressing international cooperation needs in this context, and what are the potential challenges to achieving these needs?
I mean, one big mystery to me is the question, what is it, the $300 billion question? Like, what is with these frozen foreign currency and gold reserves that they're sitting somewhere? I've heard the arguments for why they cannot be seized and given to Ukraine. These Russian money that is frozen in the West, and none of them seem nearly convincing enough for me. People talk about the people who sort of explain to me why this is not being done, why this money is not being given to Ukraine. They talk about the precedent it would set, weakening the role of the United States and the dollar as an international reserve currency. I don't know. None of those arguments feel that convincing to me. Maybe I'm sort of much closer to the war in Ukraine and the needs of Ukraine than to these big, fairly abstract geopolitical and geoeconomic issues that are quite long term. So I hear the arguments. I don't understand them. I think the push to get that money, to unlock that money for Ukraine's needs, both in fighting the war and in reconstruction and in running its government. I think that should be pretty high on the agenda, and I think with enough political will, it can be done. So I'm watching that quite closely, yeah, and I hope it comes through. I really don't see how the impediments they don't make sense to me.
Okay, and you have touched on this a little bit already, but since we're getting to the bottom of the hour, I want to make sure you get any final comments or thoughts about this out there for our audience. This audience member said, assuming Ukraine wins the war, which I sincerely hope you do, how do you envision Zelensky rebuilding Ukraine, and what do you think it will take to do so?
In 1 minute.
Wow.
No pressure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of international support still. I mean, I think that's the first thing that comes to mind, is this sense of commitment on the part of the world to, really see Ukraine as a bastion and an example of how democracies can rise out of wars of aggression and imperialism and can be brought into the European family. I think that has to become almost like a generational conviction for the West to pull Ukraine out of the extremely difficult position it will be in at the end of the war, and to help open up channels of trade, education, economies. It's depressing to see, even in the state of full scale war, what we're seeing with relations with Poland. Where for political and economic reasons, Polish truckers and farmers are trying to block the border and block Ukraine's ability to trade with the world. That kind of thing needs to stop on a very kind of fundamental level if Ukraine is going to be helped in its recovery after the invasion, after the war. But yeah, I think the world will need to help quite a lot. I don't think Ukraine will be able to do it alone.
Thank you so much. And for our final question here, Tamar, what is life like in Ukraine?
Well, Simon can speak to that too.
Yes.
So I'll, and we only have, as I say, is 1 minute, but the surprising thing about life in Ukraine is that it's very life affirming. You're in the middle of a war and you're meeting people whose relatives have died, and you're taking the train and who gets on, amputees, and you're going to places where people's houses have been destroyed and where people's factories that their fathers spent 25 years building have been reduced to matchsticks, and all that is horrible. And Simon talked about the trauma, but it is also incredibly life affirming to live in a place where just about everybody is focused on something bigger than themselves and willing to make incredible sacrifices for that thing that they're focused on. And indeed, the thing that they're focused on are something I hold very dear, which are democratic values. So, I consider it a privilege to be here, even though there's an awful lot of pain and suffering, and, being in a war zone, it's a war zone.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you both.
I agree.
No, Simon, please go ahead.
No, that's right. Yeah, just one final point. I think I saw depression setting in most acutely among Ukrainians who were not able to find a way to help. Usually these were refugees who had to flee abroad, and this includes some of my family from Odessa. They went to the Czech Republic to get to safety. The women and my niece. And it was so hard for them psychologically because they couldn't find a way to be helpful to the war effort. Once they got back and they could at least do something, to at least be present, they seemed, even though they were in greater physical danger, they seemed much more, how to put it, alive, happy, not depressed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you both so much for this fascinating and insightful conversation. I feel very lucky to have been a part of it. And I want to turn the microphone, the stage off to my colleague Rachel to do some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Katie. And if the two of you have anything that you'd like to close out with, please feel free as well.
Thanks for the opportunity. Great conversation.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for keeping the focus on the war.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I want to echo what Katie said as well. Thank you so much for being here and for having this very important conversation as we just passed the 2nd anniversary of the war. I know our audience is very appreciative as well, but we just really, we're happy to have you here and to share about your book, Simon. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.